The archive of void records on Nexara Station was a place where civilizations went to be forgotten. It was a subterranean cathedral of cold obsidian and humming data glass, situated 3 kilometers beneath the glittering spire of the Synod High Council. Here, the air was kept at exactly 4 degrees Celsius to preserve the integrity of the ancient biological drives, and the only sound was the rhythmic pulse of the ventilation system. Lirienthal liked the cold. It was honest. It didn't pretend to be welcoming, much like the bureaucratic machine she had served for 12 standard years. As a senior archivist, Lyrian's job was to finalize the erasure of history. When a species failed the cosmic survival test, she was the one who stamped the file with the red seal of finality. Today was a landmark day for her department, though not a joyous one. She was processing the final transfer of the Ember Reach, a sector of space once home to a volatile, noisy, and remarkably stubborn species known as humanity. 1,000 years ago, during the Great Aurelian Blackout, their star system had simply stopped existing on the galactic grid. No distress calls, no debris. Just an abrupt, terrifying silence. Lyrian stared at the holographic file on her desk. The Terran status, extinct. Potential for reclamation, maximum. Under the current Synod mandate, after a millennium of silence, a dead system's assets were to be liquidated and redistributed to the highest bidders among the sovereignty's inner circle. The mining conglomerates were already circling like scavengers over a dying beast. They wanted the asteroid belts, the frozen moons, and the theoretical energy wells that the humans had supposedly been developing before they burned themselves out. Senior archivist, a synthesized voice chirped, breaking her concentration. It was Jen, her assistant, a bioluminescent crystalline entity whose light was currently a frantic, flickering violet. We have a level alpha breach in Terminal 22. Lyrian didn't look up. File a maintenance ticket, Jen. The docking sensors have been twitchy since the last solar flare. Probably a cloud of ion dust triggering the proximity alarms. Sir, with all due respect, this isn't dust. Jen's voice box crackled with static, a sign of extreme stress. The defense grid didn't just trigger, it surrendered. The vessel at Terminal 22 used a primal founding key. It's an organic signature, ma'am. The system recognized it instantly because the master file is currently active on your terminal. Lyrian felt a cold prickle of unease crawl up her spine. She looked down at the glowing red stamp on her screen. Humanity. Extinct. Extinction code 497. She looked back at Jen, who was now pulsating a fearful, jagged white. That's a systemic impossibility, Lyrian said, her voice flat, though her heart had begun to drum against her ribs. Biological keys degrade over 50 years without a living host. You're telling me someone is spoofing a signal that's been dead for 10 centuries? Security squads are standing down, Jen continued, his crystalline limbs trembling. The automated defense matrix identified the ship as a founding-tier diplomatic entity. It has priority override over everything, including the High Arbiter's private channels. It's already docked. They're coming up, Lyrian. Lyrian stood up so abruptly her chair skidded across the obsidian floor. She bypassed the elevator and marched toward the observation deck overlooking the primary docking rings. Behind her, Jen hovered anxiously, his bioluminescence fading to a dull, sickly gray. When she reached the reinforced transparency of the deck, she found it already crowded with mid-level bureaucrats and security enforcers who looked like they didn't know whether to draw their weapons or kneel in prayer. Down in the cavernous, brightly lit hangar, the ship rested like a predator in a cage of light. It was an elongated wedge of brushed dark metal, lacking the bulbous, organic curves favored by Synod architecture. It looked brutal. It looked intentional. It was a ship designed to survive a collision with a moon and keep on firing. There were no scorch marks, no signs of a desperate flight from a dying sun. It looked pristine, as if it had been manufactured yesterday and then waited 1,000 years for this exact moment to arrive. The ship bore a name in a sharp geometric script that Lyrian recognized from the old archives, the Vanguard of Silence. With a heavy pneumatic hiss that echoed through the audio feeds, the ship's primary boarding ramp descended. The air in the hangar seemed to freeze. Lyrian leaned forward, her palms pressing against the glass. 3 figures walked down the ramp. They possessed the bipedal locomotion and standard sensory organs, of the ancient Terran descriptions, but there was nothing frail about them. They didn't look like survivors of an apocalypse. They walked with the measured, terrifying confidence of people who had come to collect a very old debt. The woman in the lead wore a charcoal gray suit of a woven material that looked like armor but flowed like silk. Her face was a mask of calm, her expression pleasant but entirely devoid of warmth. This was Commander Juno Voss. To her left, a younger man named Silas Thorne walked with the focused, slightly annoyed energy of a scholar who found the entire galaxy to be a poorly written footnotes. On the right was Exarch Myra Vane, an older woman with silver hair pulled back in a rigid bun, her eyes scanning the room with the clinical precision of a surgeon. The station's chief of security, a hulking four-armed brute, stepped forward, his translation collar glowing a warning orange. "Halt! Identify yourselves and state your species designation. Your clearance is tied to a defunct file. You are trespassing on a sovereign synod installation." Juno Voss stopped. She didn't flinch at the armed guards or the dozens of rifles aimed at her chest. She looked up, her gaze seemingly piercing through the glass to find Lyrian in the observation deck. Her voice, when it came through the station's automated translation system, was smooth, professional, and chillingly polite. "We are the authorized delegation of the United Terran Remnant," Juno said. "We hold sovereign claim over the Ember Reach and all its adjacent territories. Our file is not defunct. It was simply waiting for the interest to accumulate." Silas Thorne stepped forward and offered a remarkably thin data wafer to the security chief. "We've reviewed the docket for today's High Council session," he said, his voice carrying a sharp metallic edge of sarcasm. "We noted that item 1 on the agenda is the auction of our home. We're here to inform you that the property is no longer on the market. In fact, we've come to discuss your back rent for the last millennium of unauthorized surveillance." Up on the observation deck, Lyrian Thal felt the blood drain from her face. The panic was already spreading. Communicators were flashing, and aides were scrambling for the exits to alert the High Arbiter. But as Lyrian watched the 3 humans patiently wait for an escort, she realized that the terror wasn't rooted in a fear of ghosts. It was a fear of the truth. The Synod had built its entire economic stability on the assumption that the dead stayed dead. Now the rightful owners were standing in the lobby, and they didn't look like they were in a forgiving mood. The High Council chamber of the Synod was a masterpiece of architectural intimidation. It was a vast, circular amphitheater where 3,000 delegates sat in tiered rows of white marble, all looking down at a single, sunken floor where petitioners were expected to plead their cases. At the apex sat High Arbiter Valerius Crax, a man whose political career was a monument to the strategic use of silence. He was currently staring at the 3 humans with an expression of mild, cultured boredom, though Lyrian, watching from the staff alcove, could see the way his fingers gripped the edges of his crystalline podium. Arbiter Crax cleared his throat, the sound amplified by the acoustic resonance of the room. "We are a body of law," he began, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone. "We acknowledge the biological anomaly of your survival. It is truly a miracle of the modern age. However, the law does not operate on miracles. According to subsection 12 of the Eternal Charter, a species that fails to maintain a physical presence in its designated sector for a period exceeding 5 centuries is legally considered to have abdicated its sovereignty. You are, at best, refugees. At worst, you are squatters in a system that has moved on without you." Commander Juno Voss stood in the center of the floor, looking entirely unimpressed by the scale of the room. She didn't look up at the thousands of delegates. She looked directly at Crax. "We didn't abdicate anything, Arbiter. We initiated a tactical withdrawal. There is a distinction in the law that your archives seem to have conveniently misplaced." "Refugees or not," Crax continued, ignoring her, "the Ember Reach has been integrated into the Synod's strategic energy grid. We have invested billions of credits into the development of the obsidian shards. To return this territory to a species of... what was the last census? 12 billion? To return it to a ghost population would be an act of economic suicide for the galaxy." Silas Thorne stepped forward, tapping a sequence on his portable terminal. "Actually, Arbiter, if we're going to talk about the law, let's talk about the Genesis Mandate. It's a foundational piece of legislation that predates your charter by nearly 2 millennia. It states that a founding tier species, which humanity is, by the way, retains a permanent, non-expiring veto over any territorial reallocation of its ancestral cradle. You didn't repeal it. You just hid it in a Sector 7G subfolder and hoped no one would have the clearance to find it. Crax's eyes narrowed. That mandate is archaic. It hasn't been used in 3,000 years. Law doesn't have an expiration date just because it's inconvenient for your bottom line, Silas countered, a smirk playing on his lips. We've spent the last few hundred years studying your legal system while we were, as you put it, dead. We know your rules better than your own auditors do. We didn't come here to start a war, Arbiter. We came here to perform an audit. The room erupted into a cacophony of whispers. An audit? The very idea was an insult to the Synod's dignity. Crax raised a hand to quiet the chamber. You speak of an audit? You are 3 people on a single ship. You have no military, no economy, and no standing in this assembly. By what authority do you think you can audit the sovereignty? By the authority of the silent, Myra Vane said, her voice soft but carrying a weight that silenced the room. For 1,000 years, you have classified the Ember Reach as a graveyard. You used our silence as a shield to justify the exploitation of the outer systems. You told the galaxy that the dark was empty, but it wasn't. We were there, and we weren't alone. Juno Voss stepped back into the center of the light. While your mining syndicates were carving up our moons, we were running a shadow network. We've salvaged 42 deep space colonies that your records list as lost to pirate raids or technical failures. We have over 400,000 non-human survivors living within our shielded habitats. We have the logs, the testimonies, and the financial trails that link their disappearances to your private security firms. Crax's face turned a sickly shade of pale. That is a baseless accusation. You are attempting to deflect from your own lack of standing by weaving a conspiracy theory. It's not a theory when you have the receipts, Silas added, his voice dripping with sarcasm. We've mapped every credit transfer, every Black Ops deployment, and every redacted signal from the last 7 centuries. You didn't just ignore us, Crax. You used our quarantine as a convenient rug to sweep all your dirty laundry under. Well, we're here to pull the rug out. The High Arbiter leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low hiss. You think you can walk in here and dismantle a millennium of stability with a handful of files? You have no leverage. Even if every word you say is true, you are still just 3 humans in a room full of your enemies. Security, detain the delegates. They are clearly a threat to the administrative peace of the station. The security enforcers moved in, their heavy boots thumping against the marble floor. But before they could reach the sunken floor, Juno Voss raised a small, geometric device. I wouldn't do that if I were you, she said, her voice perfectly calm. We didn't bring a fleet because we didn't need one. Our ship is currently slave to the Nexara Central Reactor. If our heartbeats stop, or if we're prevented from returning to our vessel within the next 60 minutes, a pulse resonance signal will be broadcast through your primary energy grid. And what would that do? Crax sneered, though he signaled the guards to halt. It would synchronize your reactor with the Aurelian frequency, Juno replied, the same frequency that turned our sun into a localized blackout. We spent 1,000 years learning how to survive that silence. You haven't had a single second of practice. You want to see what happens when the lights go out for real? Liren Thal, watching from the alcove, felt a wave of terrifying admiration. They weren't just diplomats. They were architects of a perfect, inescapable trap. They had walked into the heart of the enemy's power, unarmed and outnumbered, and within 20 minutes they had seized control of the narrative, the law, and the very air everyone was breathing. The human delegation didn't want a seat at the table. They wanted to flip the table over and show everyone the rot underneath. Arbiter Crax stared at Juno Voss, his jaw tight, his carefully constructed mask of authority beginning to crack. The silence in the chamber was no longer the silence of an empty grave. It was the silence of a predator that had finally stopped stalking and was now simply waiting for its prey to realize it was already dead. Fine, Crax spat, the word sounding like a curse. You have the floor for the preliminary hearing, but don't think for 1 second that this ends with a few clever legal tricks. The Synod is the galaxy. You are a footnote. Footnotes have a habit of being the only part of the book people actually remember, Silas whispered, loud enough for the audio sensors to pick up. Juno Voss turned away from the podium, her eyes meeting Lyrian's once more. It was a look of profound ancient fatigue, but beneath it there was a spark of something Lyrian hadn't seen in 12 years of archiving the dead. It was hope, but it wasn't the soft, gentle hope of a dreamer. It was the hard, cold hope of a survivor who was finally coming home to settle the score. The game has changed, Lyrian thought as she watched the delegates begin to argue in a dozen different languages. The dead are back, and they brought the receipts. Was this return about justice, or was it about a warning we weren't ready to hear? Lyrian turned back to her console, her fingers trembling as she began to bypass her own department's security locks. She had spent a decade recording the end of stories. For the first time in her life, she wanted to see what happened in the next chapter. The guest quarters assigned to the Terran delegation were located in the Spire of Remittance, a towering needle of transparent alloy that looked out over the artificial event horizon of Nexara Station. To the Synod, it was a gesture of high-level hospitality. To Commander Juno Voss, it was a glass cage designed to measure their every movement and breath. She stood by the window, her silhouette a sharp, unyielding line against the swirling violet light of the black hole at the station's center. Her hands were clasped behind her back, a habit born from 20 years of bridge commands, where a twitch of a finger could mean the difference between life and a cold death in the void. Exarch Myra Vane sat at a small obsidian table, her silver hair catching the flickering light of a physical candle she had brought from their ship. It was an archaic thing, a stick of rendered fat and a cotton wick, yet it provided the only light in the room that felt honest. The station's ambient glow was too perfect, too sanitized, filtered through 1,000 layers of bureaucratic comfort. "Do you think they believe us, Juno?" Myra asked, her voice soft but steady. Juno didn't turn around. "It doesn't matter if they believe us, Myra. It only matters that they are afraid of the paperwork we brought. These synod slugs don't operate on truth. They operate on the fear of losing their margins. Silas is down there right now sharpening his teeth on their legal code. He'll keep them busy while we prepare for the next phase." Myra sighed, a sound that carried the weight of 10 centuries. "Sometimes I look at this station and I feel like a ghost walking through a museum of things we once cared about. 1,000 years, Juno. 30 generations of our people lived and died in the subterranean vaults of the moon and the hidden bunkers of Earth. They spent their entire lives in artificial light, breathing recycled air that tasted of copper and old sweat, all so that we could one day stand in a room like this. We did what we had to do," Juno said, her voice dropping into a low, gritty register. "We went dark because the alternative was a total wipeout. If we hadn't triggered the blackout, if we hadn't mastered the pulse resonance field to hide our thermal footprint, the things that hurt our first radio bursts would have picked our bones clean before the first century was over. We didn't just hide, Myra. We stood guard. The door to their quarters hissed open, not with the smooth authority of a high-ranking official, but with the hesitant, stuttering rhythm of someone bypassing a security lock. Lyrian Thal stepped into the room, her gray archivist uniform looking rumpled, and her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and desperate curiosity. She froze when she saw Juno, whose hand had moved instinctively toward the empty holster at her hip. "Easy, Commander," Myra said gently, raising a hand. "It is the archivist from the docking bay, the one who looks like she hasn't slept since the last millennium." Lyrian swallowed hard, her gaze darting between the two women. "I am not supposed to be here. If High Arbiter Cracks finds out I've accessed the restricted guest levels without a formal escort, I'll be demoted to the waste reclamation decks by sunrise." "Then why are you here, Archivist?" Juno asked, her posture relaxing only slightly. "Looking for more files to delete?" Lyrian took a step forward, her voice a frantic whisper. "I found the unredacted logs from the first survey fleet. 1,000 years ago, the Synod didn't just find a silent system. They found a signal, a very specific, very high-yield energy signature that matched the theoretical models of your stellar resonance research. They knew you were still there, or at least that your technology was still functioning, but they didn't send a rescue team. They didn't even send a probe to investigate. They signed the extinction order within 48 hours. Juno's expression didn't change, but Myra saw the way her jaw tightened. 48 hours, she repeated. They didn't even wait for a heartbeat. They wanted the reach, Lyrian said, her words tumbling out in a rush. They wanted the resources without the inhabitants. But that's not why I'm here. I found something else. In the deeper layers of the archive, there are reports of 83 missing outposts, not just Terran ones. Synod colonies, mining platforms, research stations, they all went dark in the exact same way your system did. Abrupt, absolute silence. No debris, no distress calls. The official reports say it was pirates or equipment failure, but the telemetry, it's identical to what preceded your blackout. Myra Vane stood up, her aristocratic bearing replaced by a sharp scientific intensity. And did you see the acoustic shearing? Did you see the way the background radiation seemed to flatline just before the signal loss? Lyrian nodded. It was like the universe just stopped listening. Juno walked over to the archivist, her height and presence looming over the smaller woman. You're taking a big risk coming here, Lyrian. Why? What do you want from us? I want to know if I'm serving a government of murderers, Lyrian said, her voice shaking, but her eyes remaining fixed on Juno's. I've spent my life filing away the dead. I've stamped thousands of folders with the word extinct. I always believed the Synod was a force of order, a way to keep the galaxy from falling into the chaos of the old wars. But if we left you to die, if we're still leaving people to die just to keep the energy credits flowing, then the archive isn't a library, it's a mass grave. Juno looked at the archivist for a long moment, searching for any sign of a trap. She saw only the raw, aching honesty of someone whose world had just been shattered. Sit down, archivist, Juno said, her voice softening for the first time. If you want the truth, you're going to need a drink. Myra, give her some of the deep vault coffee. It's bitter as hell, but it'll keep her grounded. As Myra poured a dark steaming liquid from a metallic thermos, Juno sat across from Lyrian. You're right to be scared, Lyrian. The Synod is hiding a lot more than just our survival. The thing that's out there, the thing we call the Hollow, it doesn't just kill, it consumes. It's attracted to the very noise that this station generates every second. High-yield data, massive energy outputs, the chaotic chatter of thousands of species. To the Hollow, Nexara isn't a center of power. It's a dinner bell. We stayed quiet for 10 centuries to save ourselves, Myra added, placing a cup in front of Lyrian. But we also stayed quiet because we knew that if we reached out to you, we would lead the predator straight to your door. We sacrificed our sun, our sky, and 30 generations of our children's freedom just to keep that bell from ringing. And your leaders knew. They knew what was coming, and they decided that as long as they were the ones holding the credits, it didn't matter who got eaten in the dark. Lyrian took a sip of the coffee and winced at the bitterness. So what happens now? You've come back. You've made the noise. Won't it find us? Juno Voss leaned forward, her eyes glowing with a terrifying, patient light. We didn't just spend 1,000 years hiding, Lyrian. We spent 1,000 years preparing a cage. We're not here to plead for our lives. We're here to take over the hunt. But before we can do that, we have to clear the rot out of this station. And we're going to need someone on the inside who knows how to read the dead files. Lyrian looked at her cup, then at the two women who had returned from a grave of their own making. I'm an archivist, she whispered. I don't know anything about hunting monsters. You know where the bodies are buried, Juno said, a grim smile touching her lips. In this station, that's the same thing. Now tell me about High Arbiter Krax's personal security detail. Does he still use the Mark IV Sentinel drones, or has he upgraded to something with a bit more grit? As the three women began to map out the hidden geography of Nexara, far above them in the High Council spire, a single red light began to blink on an ancient, neglected sensor. It was a frequency shear, moving slowly but relentlessly toward the sector. The silence was coming back, and this time, it was hungry. The air in the High Council chamber felt like it was made of jagged glass. Silas Thorne adjusted the lapels of his suit, feeling the familiar cold hum of his portable data folio against his ribs. He was 35 years old, but in this room, surrounded by beings who measured their lifespans in centuries, he felt like a child. Yet as he looked up at the tiered rows of the Synod delegates, he felt no intimidation. He felt only a profound, stinging contempt. These were the masters of the galaxy. They sat in their marble chairs draped in silks and crystalline furs, debating the price of asteroid belts while the very foundations of their civilization were being eaten by a shadow they refused to acknowledge. Silas had spent his entire life studying the records they had tried to delete. He had memorized their laws, their loopholes, and their lies. He wasn't just a lawyer, he was a vengeful ghost with a law degree. High Arbiter Valerius Crax sat at the center of the obsidian dais, his many-limbed form draped in ceremonial robes of shimmering white. He looked down at Silas with the kind of detached curiosity a gardener might show a particularly resilient weed. "Representative Thorne," Crax began, his voice echoing through the chamber like a funeral bell. "You have been granted 15 minutes to present your legal standing. We have reviewed your initial claims regarding the Genesis Mandate. While the document is historically significant, it has been superseded by 12 centuries of sovereign legislation. Your claim of territorial grievance is, quite frankly, a procedural dead end." Silas didn't blink. He didn't raise his voice. He simply tapped a command on his folio, and a massive holographic map of the Ember Reach flared to life in the center of the chamber. It wasn't the map the Synod used. It was a live feed from the Vanguard's passive sensor arrays, showing the sector in terrifying, high-definition detail. "With all due respect, Arbiter, the law doesn't care about your convenience," Silas said, his voice carrying a sharp, metallic bite. "You claim we abdicated our sovereignty because we went quiet. But according to Section 9, Clause 4 of your own Internal Security Act, the one you passed 700 years ago to justify the annexation of the Draconis Fringe, sovereignty is defined by the ability to maintain and defend a localized energy lattice." Crax's eyes narrowed. "And your point is?" "My point," Silas said, walking a slow circle around the holographic map, "is that while you were busy selling mining rights to our moons, we were maintaining a pulse resonance field that covers over 400 billion cubic kilometers of space. That field hasn't wavered for a single microsecond in 10 centuries. By your own law, we haven't been absent. We've been the most efficient border patrol unit in the history of this assembly. You didn't find an empty house, Crax. You found a house where the owner turned off the porch light and sat in the dark with a shotgun." A murmur of nervous laughter and outraged gasps rippled through the gallery. In the lower tiers, a representative from the mining syndicate stood up, his translation collar flashing a furious red. "This is regulatory extortion. That field was a hazard. It interfered with our transit lanes for a millennium. If anything, you owe us for the lost revenue of 36 trade routes." Silas turned his gaze toward the mining representative, his expression one of bored amusement. "Oh, you want to talk about lost revenue? That's fantastic, because my colleague Exarch Vane has been compiling a list of the 83 colonies that vanished while your syndicates were cutting corners on their shielding. Those trade routes didn't fail because of our field. They failed because you were broadcasting high-yield signals into a sector you knew was under quarantine. You were ringing the dinner bell, and when the guests showed up and ate your ships, you filed an insurance claim and blamed the ghosts." "Sit down, Representative," Crax roared, slamming his gavel onto the dais. The sound cracked through the chamber like a gunshot. "Mr. Thorne, you are teetering on the edge of a contempt charge. You were brought here to discuss the status of humanity, not to launch a crusade against the Synod's economic infrastructure." "I'm doing both, Arbiter," Silas said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous growl. "Because they're the same thing. You declared us extinct because you couldn't figure out how to monetize our survival. You ignored the warnings of the first survey fleet because you were too busy calculating the value of the iridium in our asteroid belts. You left us in the dark, and in doing so, you left yourselves exposed." The temperature in the chamber suddenly dropped. It wasn't a slow cooling. It was a sudden, violent plunge that made the delegates shiver and the holographic displays flicker with static. Silas felt it first, a sharp metallic tang on his tongue that tasted like copper and ozone. He looked up at the ceiling, where the massive ceremonial broadcast beacon was pulsing with a rhythmic, sickly yellow light. Silas tapped his earcom. "Juno, we've got static. It's early. The shear is hitting the station's outer spectrum." On the private channel, Juno's voice was a gritty, hurried whisper. "We see it, Silas. The station's environmental controls are already glitching, Krax isn't just trying to talk you down, he's trying to suffocate the room. He's diverted power from the life support scrubbers to the broadcast beacon. He's trying to drown out your signals with a maximum power transmission to the inner systems. The bastard's calling for help, Silas muttered, his hand moving to the override key on his folio. Or he's trying to make sure no one hears us when the gravity fails. In the gallery, the panic was beginning to set in. Delegates were coughing, their movements becoming sluggish as the oxygen levels in the room were systematically lowered. Krax sat unmoved, his robes shielding him from the cold, his expression one of icy, murderous triumph. "It seems we are experiencing a minor technical malfunction," Krax said, his voice amplified by the beacon's surging power. "I suggest we recess this session until the station's engineers can restore environmental stability. Security, escort the Terran delegate back to his ship for his own safety." Two security drones detached from the walls, their crimson eye sensors locking onto Silas. They didn't move like standard escort units. They moved like predators closing in for a KIA order. "I'm not going anywhere," Silas said, his fingers flying across his interface. He wasn't just defending himself. He was fighting for the 40,000 people sitting in that room who didn't realize they were about to be sacrificed for a politician's pride. Silas slammed his hand onto the master override. A massive, vibrating chord of sound erupted from his folio, a harmonic pulse that resonated through the floorboards and into the very bones of everyone in the chamber. It wasn't a noise. It was a physical weight. The two security drones suddenly stuttered, their internal gyros failing as the pulse resonance field from Silas's device clashed with the station's flickering gravity. "What are you doing?" Krax shouted, standing up and pointing a trembling finger at Silas. "This is an act of war." "No, Arbiter, this is a glitch fix," Silas shouted over the rising hum of the resonance. "You want to talk about safety? Then shut down that beacon. You're broadcasting a signal that the Hollow can track from across the quadrant. You're painting a target on the forehead of every living soul on this station." The lights in the chamber began to fail, plunging the room into a terrifying, flickering twilight. In the darkness, the vanishing star field beyond the reinforced windows became visible to everyone. The delegates screamed as they watched a nearby transit gate, a structure 3 kilometers wide, simply dissolve into a cloud of pixelated dust, its light swallowed by an expanding, jagged void. The silence was here. Silas Thorne stood in the center of the chaos, his suit rumpled, his breathing heavy in the thinning air. He looked up at Krax, who was now clutching the edges of his podium in genuine, unbridled terror. "You had 1,000 years to prepare for this moment, Krax," Silas said, his voice surprisingly clear in the acoustic vacuum of the room. "You spent them counting coins. We spent them counting heartbeats. Now give me the grid, or watch your empire turn into a footnote before the hour's out." The High Arbiter looked at the void, then at the man who had come back from the dead to save him. For a single agonizing second, the entire galaxy hovered on a razor's edge. Then with a shaking hand, Krax reached for the master control key. The first assassination attempt wasn't a bullet. It was a choice to let the dark in. And as the station groaned under the weight of the coming silence, Silas realized that the legal battle was over. The audit had begun. Was it the law that failed us? Or our own fear of what lies beyond the records we keep? Silas felt the floor tilt as the station's artificial gravity gave one final, dying sigh. He looked toward the exit, where he knew Juno and Myra were already moving toward the reactor core. They had 60 minutes to save a galaxy that had tried to kill them. It was more than enough time for a human. The screaming started exactly 4 seconds after the lights went out. It wasn't the sound of terror one might hear in a crowded theater or during a planetary bombardment. This was a hollow echoing sound, stripped of its resonance, as if the air itself was refusing to carry the weight of the human voice. In the pitch blackness of the High Council chamber, the only thing visible was the pale, sickly yellow flicker of the ceremonial beacon at the apex of the spire, which was now pulsing like a dying heart. Commander Juno Voss didn't wait for the artificial gravity to stabilize. She had spent 5 years training in the null G pits of the lunar core, where the darkness was absolute and the oxygen was a luxury. To her, this wasn't a crisis. It was Tuesday. She lunged through the darkness, her hand finding Lilienthal's shoulder with the grip of a hydraulic press. "Stay low, archivist," Juno barked, her voice cutting through the panic like a serrated blade. "If you stand up, you're just a taller target for the spatial shearing." Lyrian was hyperventilating, the copper taste of ozone filling her mouth. I can't see anything. The sensors are zeroed. We're going dark, Juno." "We've been dark for 1,000 years, kid," Juno grunted, pulling the archivist toward the center of the floor where Silas was still holding the resonance folio. "We're just inviting the rest of the galaxy to the party. Silas, status report." Silas Thorne was a shadow illuminated by the faint blue glow of his data wafer. "The grid's foobar, Commander." Crax's boys tried to lock the primary relays, but they ended up tripping the harmonic safeties. The station is trying to vent the energy, but the hollow is already chewing on the outer hull. "We've got maybe 20 minutes before this entire spire becomes an acoustic vacuum." Juno reached them, her eyes adjusting to the infrared spectrum of her ocular implants. She could see the security drones hovering in the air, their sensors spinning in confused circles as the spatial erosion scrambled their targeting logic. Behind the drones, High Arbiter Valerius Crax was being shielded by a phalanx of elite enforcers, their shimmer cloaks flickering as the power dipped. "Crax!" Juno roared, her voice amplified by her suit's internal speakers. "You want to die in a marble chair, or do you want to move?" The High Arbiter's voice came back, thin and jagged. "This is your doing, Terran. You brought the silence. You cursed us." Juno ignored the accusation. She didn't have time for a political debate with a man who was seconds away from being unhappened by the void. She turned back to Silas and Lyrian. "We're bugging out. Terminal 7 is too far on foot with the gravity flickering. We take the maintenance chutes." "Lyrian, you said you know the guts of this place. Which way to the primary cooling spine?" Lyrian pointed a trembling finger toward the service hatch hidden behind the Council's obsidian dais. "Through there. It drops 6 levels into the atmospheric scrubbers. From there, we can hit the transit tubes, but it's a tight squeeze." "Better a tight squeeze than a permanent vacancy," Silas muttered, tucking his folio into his suit. "Let's move. Check your 6, folks. This is about to get gritty." The trio sprinted across the polished floor, ignoring the delegates who were crawling over each other in the dark. As they reached the dais, a blast of white-hot plasma scorched the air inches from Juno's head. One of the Synod enforcers had finally found his nerve, firing blindly into the shadows. "Stow it, you buckethead!" Juno screamed, drawing a compact kinetic pistol from a hidden compartment in her sleeve. She didn't fire back to kill. She aimed for the ceiling tiles above the guards. A heavy slab of acoustic alloy crashed down, creating a temporary barricade between them and the guards. They dove through the maintenance hatch just as the gravity gave a violent, upward lurch. Lyrian felt her stomach flip as they slid down a dark, narrow tube lined with humming fiber optic cables. The air here was hotter, smelling of scorched silicon and the metallic tang of heavy water coolant. They tumbled out into a subterranean gallery where the walls were covered in thick, pulsating conduits that looked like the veins of a mechanical titan. This was the guts of Nexara. Here, the polished marble and crystalline displays of the upper levels were replaced by the brutalist reality of survival. Steam hissed from broken valves, and the floor was a grating of rusted iron. 30 meters to the next junction, Lyrian wheezed, pushing herself up from the floor. Her archivist uniform was torn, and a smear of grease stained her forehead. But the terror in her eyes was being replaced by something else, a frantic, analytical focus. Juno checked her wrist display. "We've lost 10% of the station's structural integrity. The hollow is stripping the outer plating like an onion. We need to reach the vanguard before the docking ring shears off." As they moved through the junction, they encountered a squad of Synod maintenance workers. These weren't the high-ranking delegates Silas had insulted earlier. These were the thousands of low-level staff who kept the station breathing. They were huddled in a corner, their faces pale, watching as the shadows at the end of the hallway began to warp and stretch in ways that defied geometry. "Please," one of them shouted, a small, multi-limbed being with 4 eyes wide in terror. "The transit gates are locked. We can't get to the escape pods." Silas slowed down, his eyes darting toward the maintenance crew. "We can't leave them here, Juno." Juno didn't stop. "We have 3 seats on the Vanguard, Silas. 3. And we're already pushing the weight limit with the resonance core." "We're not talking about seats," Silas snapped, his voice echoing in the metallic hallway. "We're talking about the mission. You said we came back to show them what it means to be a founding tier species. Is this what it looks like? Leaving the workers to get zeroed while the brass hides in their bunkers?" Juno stopped. She turned to look at Silas, then at the huddling workers, then at Lyrian. The humanistic theme she had preached in the council, the idea that humanity had survived by learning the value of every single heartbeat, was staring her in the face. It wasn't just a talking point for a speech. It was a choice that cost oxygen. Lyrian stepped forward. "The Vanguard's docking bay has an atmospheric bubble, doesn't it? If we can get them into the service lifts, they can hunker down in the vacuum-sealed cargo bays. It won't be a ride in first class, but they'll breathe." "It'll slow us down," Juno said, her voice gravelly. "If we don't hit the resonance gate in 12 minutes, no one breathes." "Then we better run faster," Silas said, reaching out to grab the smallest maintenance worker and pulling him toward the transit tube. "Move it, people. Stay in the light. If the air turns cold, don't stop to check why." They became a frantic, ragtag caravan. Juno led the way, her kinetic pistol clearing the path of malfunctioning drones and falling debris. Silas and Lyrian brought up the rear, herding 20 terrified Synod workers through the darkening veins of the station. The cost of their choice became apparent at the fourth junction. The floor beneath them buckled, a section of the hallway simply vanishing into a jagged hole of pure nothingness. One of the workers, a tall, spindly being, stumbled. Before Silas could reach him, the silence swallowed the worker's foot. There was no blood, no scream. The limb was simply edited out of reality. The worker collapsed, staring at the empty space where his leg had been, with a look of profound, silent confusion. Juno grabbed the worker by the collar and hauled him onto her back. "Don't look at it," she roared. "Just breathe." They reached the primary cooling spine, a massive vertical shaft that ran the length of the station. The central elevator was a twisted wreck of metal, but the manual ladder rungs were still intact. 300 meters up," Lyrian shouted, pointing into the dark. 300 meters, Juno repeated, adjusting the weight of the wounded worker on her back. "Silas, take the point." "Lyrian, middle. I'll check the 6. They began the climb. It was a grueling vertical marathon through a shaft that was actively vibrating with the death rattle of the station. Every few seconds, a wave of acoustic shearing would wash over them, making their vision blur and their teeth ache. Halfway up, Juno felt the air thin. The scrubbers had finally died. She looked down and saw the shadows rising from the bottom of the shaft like black ink. The hollow was no longer just eating the hull, it was inside the vents. "Watch it!" Silas yelled from above. "The drones are back." A squad of Krax's elite guards appeared on the catwalks above them, their rifles glowing with a lethal, purple energy. They weren't there to rescue the workers. They were there to make sure the Terran delegation didn't live to tell the galaxy about the archives. "Drop the humans!" a guard shouted, his voice distorted by the thinning air. "The Arbiter has declared your ship confiscated." Juno didn't look up. She just kept climbing, her muscles screaming under the weight of the worker. "Silas, give them the flash." Silas reached into his folio and pulled out a small glass cylinder. He didn't fire a weapon. He triggered a localized resonance burst. The cylinder shattered, releasing a high-frequency vibration that hit the guards like a physical wall. Their shimmer cloaks shorted out, and their internal ears, sensitive to the frequency of their own language, exploded. The guards tumbled off the catwalks, falling silently into the rising dark below. "That's for the 83 colonies," Silas spat, his voice a ragged whisper. They reached the docking level with 4 minutes to spare. The hallway leading to Terminal 7 was a war zone of flickering lights and venting steam. The Vanguard sat at the end of the hall, its engines already humming with a low, deep thrum that vibrated through the floor. Juno dumped the wounded worker at the airlock door. "Get them inside," she yelled to Silas. "Seal the cargo bay." Lyrian was leaning against the bulkhead, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "We made it. We actually made it." "We haven't made it until we hit the fold," Juno said, her eyes scanning the hallway. She saw a shadow moving near the primary power conduit. It wasn't a guard. It was Valerius Krax. The High Arbiter was alone, his robes tattered, his many limbs trembling as he tried to interface a stolen data key into the Vanguard's external terminal. He was trying to hijack the ship. "You can't leave me here," Crax shrieked when he saw them. "I am the Synod. I am the voice of the sovereignty. If I die, the galaxy falls into ruin." Juno walked toward him, her kinetic pistol lowered, but her finger still on the trigger. "You're not the galaxy, Crax. You're just a man who forgot that a leader's job is to protect the people, not the prophets. Give me the ship." Crax lunged for her, his movements desperate and clumsy. Juno didn't shoot. She simply stepped aside and caught him by the arm, spinning him around and pinning him against the bulkhead. She looked into his eyes, the eyes of a man who had spent 1,000 years lying to himself, and she saw the hollow truth. He wasn't evil in the way a monster is evil. He was evil in the way a machine is evil. He had optimized the galaxy for efficiency and forgotten about the heartbeats. "You want to survive?" Juno whispered, her voice like grinding stone. "Then you listen to the silence you created." She shoved him toward the open cargo bay where the maintenance workers were huddled. "You go in there with them. You sit on the floor, and you listen to the stories of the people you tried to erase. If we make it out of this, you're going to be the first witness in the audit." Crax looked at the workers, the beings he had classified as non-essential energy consumers, and he saw them looking back at him with a mixture of fear and pity. It was the first time in a century that he had been in a room where he wasn't the most important person. Juno slammed the airlock door and sealed it. She turned to Lyrian, who was staring at the terminal. "Archivist, you still with us?" Lyrian nodded, her hand finding the manual release for the docking clamps. "I'm Zero Dark, Commander. Let's blow this joint." They dove into the Vanguard's cockpit as the station's primary spire began to twist like wet cardboard. The Vanguard's engines roared, a sound that wasn't a scream but a symphony. They weren't just fleeing, they were carrying the light of 1,000 years into a darkness that thought it had already won. As the ship detached, the silence finally claimed Nexara. The station didn't explode. It simply faded, the light of 30,000 souls being edited out of the cosmic record. Juno Voss didn't look back. She had a fold to hit and 30 generations of promises to keep. The interior of the Vanguard of Silence didn't look like a ship. It looked like a temple dedicated to the preservation of things that shouldn't exist. The walls were lined with thousands of microfilaments, each one carrying a sliver of data, a song, a recipe, an architectural blueprint, a poem in a language that hadn't been spoken since the era of the Great Blackout. To Lyrian Thal, it was the most beautiful library she had ever seen. Commander Juno Voss sat in the pilot's chair, her hands moving with a fluid, unconscious grace across a control panel that was more glass than metal. "We're in the slipstream," she said, her voice finally losing its combat edge. "The resonance field is holding. The hollow can't see us as long as we keep the engines at a low hum." Lyrian was standing in the center of the bridge, watching the sensor displays. They were moving through a sector of space that was supposed to be empty. According to the Synod's charts, this was the dead zone, a region of space so devoid of resources that even the mining syndicates avoided it. But as the Vanguard's sensors filtered through the background radiation, a different reality began to emerge. Faint pulsing lights appeared on the screen. Thousands of them. They weren't stars. They were artificial structures, hidden within the shadows of gas giants and tucked behind the gravity wells of rogue planets. "What are those?" Lyrian whispered, her breath fogging the glass of the display. "That," Silas Thorne said, stepping onto the bridge with 2 steaming cups of synthetic tea, "is the Underground Railroad. Welcome to the Reach, Archivist." Lyrian turned to him, her eyes wide. "But the Reach is just a star system. These are all over the quadrant. You think we spent 1,000 years sitting on Earth and staring at the ceiling?" Silas asked, handing a cup to Juno. "We knew the Synod would come for us eventually. We knew the hollow would follow the noise. So we started building outposts. Not big ones, not loud ones, just places where people could stay quiet and stay alive." Juno took a sip of the tea and looked at the map. "Every time a colony went dark on your records, Lyrian, we were there. We couldn't fight the hollow, not then, but we could intercept the escape pods. We could spoof the telemetry to make it look like the ships were destroyed, while we towed them back into the resonance shadows." "You've been saving them," Lyrian said, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "For 700 years. Not just saving them, Myra Vane said, entering the bridge from the lower decks. She looked exhausted, her silver hair loose around her shoulders, but her eyes were bright with a fierce, scholarly pride. We've been integrating them. We realized early on that humanity couldn't carry the weight of the future alone. We needed the stories of others to remind us why the silence was worth the cost. Myra tapped a command on a secondary console, and the holographic display zoomed in on one of the hidden outposts. It was a sprawling habitat built into the hollowed-out core of a moon. Lyrian saw thousands of life signs, dozens of different species moving through gardens, laboratories, and living quarters. This is Sanctuary 4, Myra explained. It houses the last of the Kalan Republic. Your records say they were wiped out by a supernova 6 centuries ago. They weren't. They were just in the way of a synod trade route. We pulled their seed ships out of the path of the beam and gave them a place to grow. Lyrian felt a hot sting of tears in her eyes. The responsibility she had felt as an archivist, the duty to record the end of things, felt suddenly, painfully small. These people hadn't just recorded history, they had guarded it with their lives. "Why didn't you tell us?" Lyrian asked, her voice cracking. "If the galaxy knew you were doing this, they would have supported you. They would have joined you." Silas laughed, a bitter, sharp sound. "No, they wouldn't have. They would have demanded we share the technology so they could build louder ships and bigger guns. They would have turned our sanctuaries into tactical assets." "The Synod doesn't value survival, Lyrian. It values expansion. You can't have expansion if you have to stay quiet." He walked over to the window, looking out at the dark expanse of space. "We faced a choice 30 generations ago. We could be loud and powerful and die in a blaze of glory, or we could be quiet and patient and live to see the end of the storm. We chose the children. We chose the people who haven't been born yet." Juno Voss stood up from her chair and walked over to Lyrian. She placed a heavy, warm hand on the archivist's shoulder. "Being a founding tier species isn't about having the biggest chair in the council, Lyrian. It's about being the one who stays awake while everyone else is sleeping. It's about carrying the torch when the wind is blowing." Lyrian looked at the commander, seeing the lines of fatigue and the deep, unshakable resolve in her face. "But the cost. You stayed in the dark for 1,000 years. You lived in bunkers. You never saw a natural sun." "It was worth it," Juno said, her voice low and absolute. "Because today, we brought 300 people out of Nexara, and tomorrow we're going to start the audit of the rest of the galaxy. We didn't just come back to reclaim our home, we came back to reclaim the future." The moment of peace was shattered by a sharp, rhythmic alarm from the sensor array. Juno was back in the pilot's seat in a heartbeat. "Talk to me, Silas!" "The slipstream's being pinched," Silas shouted, his fingers flying across the keys. "Something's pulling at the resonance field. It's not the hollow. It's a synod signature." Juno's eyes narrowed. Crax's fleet. They didn't all die on the station. On the main viewer, 3 massive synod destroyers dropped out of warp, their hulls shimmering with the aggressive light of high-yield energy shields. They were positioned in a triangular formation, a classic naval ambush designed to trap a smaller vessel in a gravity well. "This is Admiral Vex of the Sovereignty 7th Fleet," a voice boomed over the open channel. "You are in possession of stolen synod property and the person of the High Arbiter. Power down your engines and prepare for boarding, or we will commence thermal bombardment." "They're shouting," Silas muttered, his face turning pale. "The idiots are using wide-spectrum radio to broadcast their demands." "They're not just shouting," Myra whispered, staring at the sensor telemetry. "They're acting as a beacon." Juno looked at the 3 destroyers, then at the dark void beyond them. She could see the spatial shearing beginning to ripple around the synod ships. The Admiral didn't realize it, but by trying to capture the Vanguard, he was painting a massive, glowing target on his own fleet. "Juno," Silas said, his voice trembling, "if we stay here to talk, the hollow hits us too. If we hit the fold now, the backwash from our engines will collapse their shields. They'll be sitting ducks in the dark." Lyrian looked at the screen, at the thousands of soldiers and crew members on those destroyers. They were part of the system that had tried to erase her, but they were also people. They were the future humanity had claimed to be protecting. "We can't just leave them," Lyrian said, her voice rising in desperation. There are 10,000 people on those ships. They don't know about the hollow. They think they're just doing their jobs. If we stop to warn them, we're zeroed, Juno said, her hand hovering over the fold throttle. This is the choice, archivist. The mission or the people in front of us. The humanistic theme was no longer a theoretical debate. It was a cold, hard calculation of lives. Juno Voss, the woman who had spent her life preparing for the survival of her species, was being asked to risk everything for the very people who wanted her dead. Juno looked at the sensor display, watching the void close in on the Synod fleet. She saw the fear in Lyrian's eyes, and she saw the mirror of her own ancestors' struggle. If she left them to die, she was no better than Krax. She was just another bureaucrat of the grave. Silas, Juno said, her voice a calm, steady anchor in the storm. Cut the resonance field. What? Silas screamed. Are you crazy? We'll be visible to everything in the quadrant. Cut the field and slave our broadcast array to their comlink, Juno commanded. We're not going to talk to the Admiral. We're going to show him the silence. Silas hesitated for a split second, then nodded. Wilco, Commander, opening the pipe. The Vanguard's resonance field dropped, and for a moment, the ship was a bright, burning spark in the dark. Juno slammed the broadcast key, sending a massive data burst directly into the Synod fleet's internal systems. It wasn't a message. It was the raw, unedited telemetry of the Hollow's attack on Nexara. She showed them the empty chairs, the vanishing gates, and the silent screams of their own colleagues. Admiral, Juno shouted into the comms, you have 30 seconds to kill your engines and drop your shields. If you don't go dark right now, you're already dead. We're opening a resonance tether. Follow our wake or stay for the dinner. The Synod destroyers hesitated. On the bridge of the lead ship, Lyrian could see the confusion, the arrogance, and then, slowly, the realization. One by one, the shimmering shields of the destroyers flickered and died. The massive ships went dark, their lights fading until they were nothing but shadows against the stars. Juno gripped the throttle. Silas, hook them. We're taking them with us. The Vanguard let out a massive, vibrating pulse of energy, creating a localized corridor of stabilized space. The three Synod destroyers, caught in the wake of the resonance field, were dragged into the slipstream just as the spatial erosion reached their previous coordinates. They hit the fold in a blinding flash of white light, leaving the silence behind. As the ship settled into the quiet rhythm of hyperspace, Juno Voss leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. Her hands were shaking. She had risked 30 generations of work for 3 ships full of enemies. Lyrian walked over to her, her voice a soft, reverent whisper. You saved them. Juno didn't open her eyes. We didn't save them, archivist. We just gave them a chance to learn the lesson. Now the real work begins. We have 10,000 Synod sailors in our wake who are about to find out that the galaxy they serve is a lie. Silas looked at the monitors, watching the Synod ships following them like ducklings. This is going to be a logistical nightmare, Juno. We don't have enough coffee for 10,000 people. Then we'll make more, Juno said, a tired smile finally touching her lips. That's what humans do, Silas. We make more. The cost of their mercy was yet to be calculated, but as the Vanguard moved toward the heart of the Reach, Lyrian Thal realized that the humanistic theme wasn't about being perfect. It was about being willing to risk the light to make sure no one else had to live in the dark. Was the responsibility to the future worth the risk of the present, or had we just invited the rot into the only safe place left? Lyrian looked out at the stars, feeling the weight of the new world they were building. The audit wasn't just for the Synod anymore. It was for everyone. The jump out of the fold was not the smooth, crystalline transition Lyrian Thal had come to expect from Synod transit gates. It felt like being dragged through a bed of jagged glass. The Vanguard of Silence groaned, its structural ribs vibrating with a frequency that made Lyrian's vision fracture into 1,000 splintered ghosts. When the stars finally settled into fixed points of light, they weren't the vibrant, crowded clusters of the galactic core. They were dim, lonely sparks scattered across a canvas of absolute, oppressive black. We're at the doorstep, Juno Voss announced, her voice strained as she wrestled with the manual stabilizers. The 3 Synod destroyers, the Aegis, the Clarion, and the Pillar, lurched into real space behind them, their hulls scorched and their sensor arrays spinning like blinded eyes. Commander, we've got a situation, Silas Thorne shouted from the tactical station. His face was bathed in the red emergency light of the bridge. The resonance tether didn't just pull the destroyers through, it dragged a piece of the storm with us. I'm picking up a massive gravitational shear in our wake. It's not a ship. It's a localized collapse. Juno's hands froze on the throttle. On the main view screen, the space they had just exited began to ripple. It looked like ink dropped into a basin of clear water, swirling and expanding until it swallowed the distant starlight. This was the Hollow. Up close, it wasn't a biological entity or a mechanical fleet. It was a predatory absence, a tear in the fabric of the universe that fed on the very energy used to observe it. Myra Vane stood behind Silas, her eyes wide as she parsed the incoming data. It's sensing the destroyer's auxiliary reactors, she whispered. Those ships are still too loud. Even with their shields down, their cooling systems are screaming in the infrared. To that thing, they're like beacons in a dark alley. Lyrian watched the monitor as one of the destroyers, the Clarion, began to drift. Its engines were flickering, trying to maintain position against the gravitational pull of the void. We have to tell them to vent their cores, Lyrian cried out. If they don't dump their heat now, it'll strip them to the atoms. Juno slammed her fist against the comms panel. Admiral Vex, do you copy? Kill your auxiliary power, vent your primary heat sinks into the local vacuum, and switch to emergency battery. You're ringing the dinner bell, Admiral. Do it now or you're zero dark 30. A jagged, static-filled voice came over the speaker. We have 10,000 souls on board. If we vent the cores, we lose life support in 6 minutes. We'll freeze in the dark. You'll be edited out of existence in 3 minutes if you don't, Juno roared. Choose your poison, Admiral. The silence that followed was agonizing. Lyrian held her breath, watching the tiny blip that represented the Clarion. For 10 centuries, the Synod had been the undisputed masters of the stars, their power built on the assumption that they could always control the environment. Now, faced with a predator that defied their physics, they were paralyzed. They're spooked, Silas muttered, his fingers flying across the keys as he tried to boost the Vanguard's resonance field to cover the drifting ship. They've spent their whole lives being the biggest fish in the pond. They don't know how to play dead. The Hollow surged, a long, spindly arm of darkness, a literal extrusion of non-space, reached out from the center of the tear and brushed against the Clarion's stern. There was no explosion. There was only a terrifying, silent erasure. The ship's entire engine section vanished, the cut so clean it looked like it had been performed by a surgeon. The rest of the destroyer began to spin wildly, venting atmosphere and screams that no one could hear. Juno's face went pale. The humanistic theme that had guided their mission, the preservation of the future, was being shredded in front of her. If she stayed to help, the Vanguard and its precious cargo of data and survivors would be consumed. If she fled, 10,000 people would be sacrificed to a monster her own ancestors had spent a millennium hiding from. Commander, we have to move, Myra said, her voice shaking. The resonance field is buckling. If we don't hit the second fold in 40 seconds, the Vanguard is toast. Juno looked at the Clarion. She saw the escape pods launching, tiny, desperate sparks of light that were immediately snuffed out by the encroaching dark. She thought of the children in the lunar bunkers, the 30 generations of humans who had lived in the shadows so that this day could happen. Was she really going to throw away their sacrifice for a ship full of people who had declared her species extinct? Then she looked at Lyrian. The archivist was staring at the screen, her hands pressed against her mouth, tears streaming down her face. In that moment, Juno didn't see a Synod bureaucrat. She saw a witness. She saw the future of a galaxy that needed to know that someone, somewhere, still cared about the cost of a life. Silas, Juno said, her voice dropping into a terrifyingly calm register. Give me the master control for the resonance core. Commander? Silas turned, his eyes wide. You can't be serious. If we boost the field that much, we'll burn out our own engines. We'll be dead in the water. We're not boosting the field to hide, Juno said, her eyes locked on the Hollow. We're boosting it to bait. We're going to overcharge the primary array and broadcast a high-yield, stabilized frequency directly away from the destroyers. We're going to be the loudest thing in the quadrant for exactly 60 seconds. You're going to draw it to us, Lyrian whispered, her voice full of awe and terror. I'm going to give the Admiral and his boys a window to bug out, Juno said, her hands moving with a fluid, lethal grace across the controls. Silas, slave the navigation to Myra's station. Lyrian, I need you to go to the cargo bay. Talk to those workers. Tell them to strap in and hold on to their hats. This is going to be a rough ride. But Commander, Silas started. That's an order, Silas. Kick the tires and light the fires. We're going loud. The vanguard of silence did something it hadn't done in 1,000 years. It screamed. The ship's resonance array, designed to dampen and hide, was inverted. A massive, brilliant pulse of golden energy erupted from the vanguard's hull, carving a path through the darkness. It was a song of defiance, a concentrated burst of human history, art, and stubbornness broadcasted into the maw of the void. The hollow reacted instantly. The dark extrusion that had been toyed with the Clarion snapped toward the vanguard like a whip. The gravitational pull intensified, dragging the human ship toward the center of the tear. Admiral, Juno screamed into the comms. Go! Move your asses while it's looking at us! The two remaining Synod destroyers didn't wait. They fired their emergency thrusters and vanished into a desperate, uncoordinated warp jump. The Clarion, crippled and silent, drifted into the wake of the Vanguard's resonance field, protected for a few precious moments by the human sacrifice. The Vanguard shuddered as the first layer of its hull began to shear. The bridge was a chaos of sparks and screaming alarms. Silas was hunched over his console, his teeth bared in a grimace of pure concentration. Resonance core at 120%. We're melting the conduits, Juno. Just a few more seconds, Juno whispered, her eyes fixed on the timer. The hollow was inches away now. Lyrian could see the nothingness of it, a void so absolute it made her soul ache. It felt like every mistake she had ever made, every file she had ever deleted, was being called back to judge her. Now, Juno roared, slamming the emergency fold lever. The Vanguard didn't jump. It exploded into a different dimension. The ship's resonance core gave one final, blinding burst of light, a whiteout signal that overloaded the hollow's sensors. And then the ship vanished into the fold. When they emerged on the other side, the silence was absolute. The bridge was dark, the only light coming from the drifting embers of shorted-out consoles. Juno sat in her chair, her head slumped forward, her breathing shallow and ragged. Silas coughed, waving away a cloud of acrid smoke. Are we zero dark? Myra checked a manual gauge. We're alive, but the Vanguard is scrap metal. The engines are fused, and the resonance array is gone. We're drifting on momentum. Lyrian unbuckled herself from her jump seat and crawled toward the window. She looked out and let out a sob that was half laugh, half cry. Look, she whispered. Beyond the scorched glass of the view screen, a planet hung in the void. It wasn't the gray, toxic husk the Synod archives had described. It was a vibrant, glowing marble of deep azure and emerald green, wrapped in a shimmering lattice of crystalline light. It was Earth, and surrounding it, like a million fireflies, were the habitats and stations of a civilization that had spent a millennium learning how to love the light in the dark. We're home, Juno whispered, looking at the planet she had never seen but had always known. They had saved the Synod sailors, and they had saved themselves. But as Lyrian looked at the damaged bridge and the exhausted faces of her companions, she realized the transformation had begun. They weren't just representatives of a dead species anymore. They were the architects of a new era, and the cost of that future was written in the scorched metal of their ship. The healing of the Vanguard was a slow, mechanical symphony performed by thousands of tiny repair drones that swarmed the ship's hull like silver bees. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the smell of ozone and the frantic energy of a civilization that didn't know how to sit still. The United Terran Remnant had mobilized. Within 6 hours of their arrival, the 300 Synod survivors and the high-ranking delegates had been transferred to the Hephaestus habitat, a massive hollowed-out asteroid that served as the industrial heart of the Reach. Lyrian Thal sat in a small, sterile observation room, staring through a pane of reinforced glass at High Arbiter Valerius Crax. The former master of the galaxy looked small. Without his shimmering robes and his marble podium, He was just an old man with too many limbs and a face full of ancient, curdled regret. He was sitting on a simple metal chair, his hands resting on a table that was currently projecting a series of decrypted documents. "These are the files I found in the deep archives," Lyrian said, her voice amplified through the room's speakers. She wasn't an archivist anymore. She was a prosecutor. "I sequenced the data from the first survey fleet, Valerius, the fleet that arrived 48 hours after the blackout." Krax didn't look up. He was staring at a specific page of text, a report signed by a man named Director Kalin, the head of the Strategic Silence Directorate 1,000 years ago. "You knew the Hollow was coming," Lyrian continued, her voice gaining strength. "You didn't just ignore the humans. You used their survival as a laboratory. You watched them go dark, and instead of sounding the alarm, you decided to see if you could harvest the energy they left behind. You turned an entire species into a buffer zone so you could keep the inner systems loud and profitable." Krax finally raised his head. His eyes were milky and unfocused. "We did what we had to do to maintain order, Lyrian. The galaxy was a tinderbox. If we had told the truth, if we had admitted that there was an apex predator hunting our signals, there would have been a mass panic. The economy would have collapsed. The transit gates would have been abandoned. We preserved the peace for 10 centuries. Is that not worth a single system?" "A single system?" Silas Thorne stepped into the room, his folio tucked under his arm like a weapon. "We're not talking about one system, Krax. We're talking about 83 colonies. We're talking about the millions of lives you edited out of the record because they were too expensive to save. You didn't preserve the peace. You preserved a ledger. You traded blood for credits and called it governance." Silas slammed his folio onto the table, and a new set of data flared to life. "This is the black box from the Clarion. We pulled it before the ship went silent. Do you want to see what your sailors were saying while they were waiting for your orders? They were begging for the light, Krax. They were calling out to a government that had already written them off as an administrative inconvenience." Krax flinched at the images of the screaming sailors. "You don't understand the burden of the High Council," he whispered. "We have to look at the big picture." "The big picture is made of small heartbeats, Krax," Juno Voss said, walking into the room. She was still wearing her scorched flight suit, a bandage wrapped around her forehead. "You spent 1,000 years looking at the stars and seeing nothing but resources. We spent 1,000 years looking at the dark and seeing our children's faces. That's why we survived and you're sitting in a cage." Juno turned to Lyrian. "Archivist, we've finished the preliminary audit of the rescued Synod personnel. 10,000 sailors, engineers, and aides. Most of them are in shock. They've been told their whole lives that humans were a myth, a cautionary tale about industrial hubris. Now they're sitting in a habitat where the air is clean, the food is real, and the people who saved them are the monsters from their bedtime stories." "It's a lot to process," Lyrian admitted. She looked at Krax, and for the first time, she felt a flicker of something other than anger. She felt pity. He was a relic of a dying system, a man who had forgotten how to be human, or whatever his species equivalent was. "We're not going to execute him, Juno," Lyrian said. "That's what the Synod would do. They'd delete the problem." Juno nodded. "We're going to do something much worse. We're going to make him help Silas draft the new galactic charter. He's going to spend the rest of his life testifying about every bribe, every redacted signal, and every hidden grave. He's going to be the living archive of his own failure." Krax let out a shaky breath, his shoulders sagging. "You are more cruel than I thought, Terran." "No," Silas said, leaning over the table. "We're just more thorough. We're not building a future on a lie, Krax. We're going to dig up every single body you buried and give them a name. That's the audit." As Silas began the grueling process of questioning the former High Arbiter, Juno signaled for Lyrian to follow her out of the observation room. They walked through the humming corridors of the Hephaestus habitat, passing groups of Synod sailors who were being tended to by human medics. The atmosphere was one of quiet, stunned transformation. A young Synod ensign, no more than 20 years old, was sitting on a bench, staring at a physical orange a human nurse had given him. He was smelling the peel, his eyes wide with a wonder that no credits could buy. "Look at him," Juno whispered. "He's the future we fought for. He doesn't know it yet, but he's never going back to the Spire." He's going to be the one who tells his grandchildren that the dark wasn't empty. Lyrian felt a warm swell of pride in her chest. For the first time, the responsibility to the future didn't feel like a heavy, crushing weight. It felt like a gift. It was the responsibility to ensure that wonder never died. "Commander, we have a signal." Myra Vane's voice came over the comms. "It's coming from the outer rim of the Reach." "Is it the hollow?" Juno asked, her hand instantly moving to her comms unit. "No," Myra said, her voice filled with a strange, soaring joy. "It's the Aegis and the Pillar, the other two Synod destroyers. They didn't jump back to the core, they jumped to our outer coordinates. They're broadcasting on a low-frequency resonance channel." "What are they saying?" Juno looked at Lyrian, then out the window at the shimmering lattice of Earth. Myra's voice came through again, clear and steady. "They're requesting permission to dock, Commander. They say they've had enough of the silence. They're asking if we have room for 10,000 more." Juno Voss let out a laugh, a loud, booming, human sound that echoed through the industrial hallway. Lyrian saw the medics and the Synod sailors look up, a ripple of surprised smiles following the sound. "Tell them to kill their engines and prepare for a resonance tether," Juno said, "and tell Silas to find another 10,000 cups of coffee. We're going to be here a while." The transformation was no longer a theory. The Underground Railroad was becoming a sovereign state. The Synod was fracturing, not from a military invasion, but from the sudden, irresistible pull of the truth. People were choosing the light over the credits, the heartbeats over the ledgers. But as Lyrian watched the two massive Synod destroyers drift into the Reach's defensive perimeter, she felt a cold prickle of intuition. The hollow was still out there. It had been driven back, but it hadn't been destroyed. It was an entropic force, a consequence of a galaxy that had been too loud for too long. "We've won the battle for the records, Juno," Lyrian said softly as they watched the ship's dock. "But the dark is still listening." Juno stood tall, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "Then we'll just have to teach the rest of the galaxy how to stay quiet, archivist. And if we can't be quiet, we'll be the light that the dark can't swallow." The lesson was taking root. The future wasn't something you waited for. It was something you built, one rescued soul at a time. And as the humanistic theme moved from the heart of the action to the foundation of a new civilization, Lyrian Thal realized that the most important file she would ever archive was the one she was living right now. Was it the fear of the dark that kept us apart, or the fear of what we would have to become to survive it? Lyrian took a deep breath of the recycled air, which today, for some reason, tasted like the promise of rain on a natural world. She was no longer an archivist of the dead. She was a witness to the living. The aftermath of a 1,000-year war that was never officially declared felt surprisingly like a quiet Tuesday morning in a recovery ward. The Hephaestus habitat was no longer a frantic industrial hub vibrating with the stress of a looming extinction. It had become a sanctuary of murmurs and the soft clinking of medical instruments. Outside the reinforced windows, the Ember Reach was a sea of stabilized light. The United Terran Remnants resonance grid was fully operational, weaving a shimmering, silent web around Earth, the Moon, and the dozens of hidden habitats that had once been the galaxy's best-kept secret. Lyrian Thal stood on the observation gantry overlooking the primary docking bay. Down below, the survivors from the Synod destroyers, the Aegis and the Pillar, were being processed. It wasn't the sterile, terrifying procedure she had imagined when she first stepped onto the Vanguard. There were no cages, no neural scans, and no red stamps. Instead, there were human volunteers handing out bowls of hot, spiced broth and blankets made of recycled fiber that actually felt like wool. "Look at them," Silas Thorne said, stepping up beside her. He looked like he had been dragged through a black hole and back, his suit wrinkled and his eyes bloodshot. But there was a sharp, satisfied grin on his face. "They're eating our soup and breathing our air, and half of them still look like they're waiting for the secret police to come out and vaporize them for liking the taste of real salt. They've spent their whole lives being told that anything outside the Synod's energy grid was a death sentence, Silas," Lyrian said, her voice soft. She watched a young Synod technician, a female with iridescent scales, hesitantly take a sip of the broth and then break into a sudden, sobbing smile. "To them, we aren't just survivors. We're the impossible made flesh. Silas leaned his elbows on the railing. It's a real piece of work, isn't it? We spent 30 generations worrying about the Hollow, worrying about the Synod's fleets, and in the end, the biggest weapon we had was a decent cup of coffee and the truth. The admiral from the Aegis, Vex, he spent the morning screaming about jurisdictional violations. Then he saw his own daughter in the medical bay. She was on the Clarion, Lyrian. He thought she was dead when the station went dark. Lyrian turned to him, her eyes wide. And he stopped screaming, Silas said, his voice dropping into a rare moment of gravity. He just sat on the floor and cried. He didn't care about the charter or the sovereign credits or the reach. He just cared that his kid was breathing. That's the audit, right there. That's the only ledger that actually matters. The conflict resolution was taking place in thousands of small, quiet moments like that across the habitat. The Great Audit wasn't a military tribunal. It was a mass realization. The Synod's power had been built on the scarcity of empathy, on the idea that resources were finite, and therefore lives were negotiable. Humanity had proven that while resources might be finite, the responsibility to protect one another was an infinite well. But the danger wasn't entirely gone. The Hollow was still a jagged, hungry tear in the fabric of the universe, lurking just beyond the resonant shadows. In the command center, Commander Juno Voss and Exarch Myra Vane were finalizing the deployment of the Harmony Network. Lyrian and Silas made their way to the center, passing groups of humans and Synod sailors who were working together to repair the Vanguard's damaged systems. The sprinkle method of integration was working. The shared labor of fixing a ship was a better diplomatic tool than 100 speeches. Z-Day is over, kid, a human engineer shouted to Lyrian as she passed, using the military slang for the day the sun went out. Welcome to the dawn. In the command center, a massive holographic display showed the entire quadrant. The 83 lost colonies were no longer red dots on a map of tragedies. They were being linked by a new kind of signal, a low-frequency, stabilized resonance pulse that didn't broadcast data, but simply projected a universal heartbeat. Commander, Lyrian said, nodding to Juno. Archivist, Juno replied. She was staring at the Hollow, which was currently a shrinking blotch of darkness on the edge of the sensor array. We've finished the calibration. The Harmony Network is ready to go loud, but not the way the Synod did it. We're not broadcasting a signal to be heard. We're broadcasting a signal to be felt. Myra Vane stepped forward, her eyes bright with a scientific fervor that bordered on the spiritual. We've discovered that the Hollow isn't just attracted to noise, Lyrian. It's attracted to entropy, to the chaotic, fragmented energy of a civilization that is tearing itself apart. The Synod was loud because it was discordant. Humanity survived because we learned how to synchronize. The Harmony Network will project a unified, stable resonance across the entire sector. To the Hollow, it will look like a solid wall of non-existence. We're turning the galaxy into a place that is too whole for a predator of the void to bite into. It's going to cost a lot of energy, Juno added, looking at Lyrian. We're going to have to shut down 50% of the industrial output of the Reach for the next 3 years to maintain the field. We're asking the people in the bunkers and the sailors on those ships to live with less so that everyone can have a tomorrow. And what did they say? Lyrian asked. Juno smiled, a genuine, warm expression that reached her eyes. They said they've been living in the dark for 1,000 years. A few more years of dim lights is a small price to pay for a sky that doesn't eat you. As the command was given to activate the Harmony Network, Lyrian felt a profound shift in the air. It wasn't a sound, but a vibration, a deep, comforting thrum that seemed to settle in her very marrow. It was the sound of 30 generations of patience, finally finding its voice. On the screen, the Hollow began to recede, the jagged edges of the void smoothing out as the resonance field pushed it back into the deep dark. Secondary characters like the previously arrogant Admiral Vex and the terrified maintenance workers from Nexara were now part of the solution. They weren't just being saved, they were being invited to help hold the line. The humanistic theme, the idea that every soul was a vital part of a larger, beautiful architecture, was no longer a theory. It was the law of the stars. Lyrian watched the darkness fade, her mind processing the sheer scale of what they had achieved. She had started this journey as a woman who spent her days filing away the dead. She had believed that extinction was an inevitable, clinical fact of the universe. Now she realized that extinction was only what happened when you forgot how to listen to the person standing next to you. The archive was no longer a place of obsidian and cold data. It was the living, breathing heart of the Hephaestus habitat. And for the first time in her life, Lyrian Thal didn't want to stamp a single thing as finished. 6 months after the fall of Nexara, the galaxy was a very different place. The Synod of Eternal Sovereignty hadn't collapsed in a violent revolution. It had simply dissolved, its member systems choosing one by one to join the Terran Accord. The promise of a sky that stayed bright and a government that didn't hide the truth was an irresistible gravity. Lyrian Thal stood on the surface of the moon, looking down at the Earthrise. She wasn't inside a bunker. She was standing in the lush G Garden, a sprawling biodome where the first natural grass was being grown in lunar soil. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and clover, a smell she had only ever read about in the dusty, forbidden files of the Deep Archive. She was 42 years old today, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't looking at the past. She was holding a small, physical tablet made of cellulose, recording the arrival of a new group of refugees. They weren't from a dead world. They were from the fringe systems, species that had been ignored by the Synod for centuries. Commander Juno Voss walked into the garden, her heavy boots crunching on the gravel path. She was wearing a simple civilian tunic, her gray hair silvered by the lunar light. She looked younger, the crushing weight of the silent war having been replaced by the busy, messy work of building a peace. "How's the intake going, archivist?" Juno asked, leaning against a support pillar. Lyrian smiled, tapping her tablet. "We've processed 2,000 today. The Kalan refugees are helping the new arrivals settle into the Sector 4 habitats. It's a bit of a cluster, honestly. We're running low on translation units, and the high-gravity species are complaining about the lunar pull, but no one's shouting about extinction." Juno laughed, a sound that was now a frequent part of the garden's acoustic landscape. "A cluster is good. A cluster means people are talking. I'll take a loud, messy argument over a quiet grave any day of the week." She walked over to a small tree, a sapling that was struggling to find its footing in the lunar dirt. "How are you doing, Lyrian?" "Really? You've spent half a year being the face of the Accord. You're the one who has to tell these people that the galaxy they knew was a lie. That can't be easy." Lyrian looked at the sapling, then back at Juno. "It's the most honest work I've ever done, Juno. I spent my whole career being a file clerk for the grave. I used to think my job was to make sure the dead were organized. Now I realize my job is to make sure the living are remembered. I'm not an archivist anymore. I'm a witness." The transformation in Lyrian was visible in her every movement. She no longer walked with the stiff, fearful posture of a bureaucrat. She moved with a quiet, certain grace. When a young refugee, a creature with 6 spindly arms and large, luminous eyes, stumbled on the path nearby, Lyrian didn't wait for a medic. She stepped forward, caught the child, and gently guided them back to their feet with a smile that needed no translation. This was the lesson humanity had brought back from the dark. It wasn't about the pulse resonance field or the fold engines. It was about the choice to be present for the smallest, most inconvenient moments of life. Later that evening, as the sun began to set over the blue curve of the earth, Lyrian sat alone in the archive, which was now a vibrant, open-access library filled with the songs and stories of 100 different worlds. She looked at her tablet, her fingers hovering over the screen, as she began to write her personal reflection for the central record. "I spent the first 35 years of my life believing that the most important thing a person could do was to be precise. I thought that by categorizing the world, by putting every tragedy and every triumph into a neat, labeled folder, I could somehow control the chaos of existence. I lived in a universe of red stamps and closed doors, a universe where the silence of a billion souls was just another administrative hurdle to be cleared. But then the humans walked into the room. They didn't come with a better filing system. They came with a staggering, terrifying patience. They showed me that survival isn't a clinical outcome, it's a moral choice. They spent a millennium in the dark, not just to save their own skins, but to ensure that the light they eventually brought back would be a light that belonged to everyone. I learned that the responsibility to the future isn't about building monuments or hoarding credits. It's about the grueling, often thankless work of making sure that the person standing next to you doesn't disappear. I used to think an archivist was a guardian of the end. Now I know that we are the guardians of the beginning. Every name we record, every story we preserve, is a promise to the generations that haven't been born yet. We are telling them that they matter, even if we never see their faces. We are telling them that in a universe as vast and cold as this one, a single heartbeat is the loudest sound there is. I am no longer afraid of the silence, because now I know how to fill it. Lyrian finished writing and leaned back, watching the data streams pulse with the life signs of the thousands of people currently sleeping in the lunar domes. The Underground Railroad was no longer a secret. It was the foundation of the new galaxy. High Arbiter Valerius Crax was still alive, living in a modest apartment in the industrial sector. He spent his days transcribing the very files he had once tried to erase. Silas Thorne was currently in the inner systems, debating the new trade laws with a ferocity that had already earned him the nickname, the Terran Terrier. Everything was changing, moving, and growing. Lyrian looked out at the stars, which were no longer symbols of a cold, predatory void. They were destinations, they were homes, and for the first time in her life, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. I wonder sometimes about the people who are still living in their own versions of the dark. Lyrian mused to herself, her voice a soft whisper in the quiet library. I wonder if they know that the most powerful thing they can do isn't to fight the shadows, but to simply refuse to let their own light go out. She thought of the thousands of people who had lived and died in the bunkers of Earth, people who never saw the sky but worked every day to make sure someone else would. It was a level of selflessness that still made her breath catch. Is there a part of yourself that you have been keeping hidden? A light you have been holding back because you are afraid the world is too dark to receive it? What if your silence is the only thing standing between someone else and the void? Lyrian stood up and walked to the edge of the biodome, where a single fragile flower, brought from a secret garden on Earth, was beginning to open its petals to the lunar dawn. She reached out and gently touched the petal, her fingers steady and warm. Then she turned and walked back toward the intake center, ready to record the next name, the next story, the next beginning. The archive was finally full, and it was only just starting. Lyrian picked up a watering can and carefully tended to the small lunar sapling, her humming a soft, human melody that harmonized perfectly with the quiet pulse of the station.